Welcome everyone. My name is Miriam Dogimab. I'm the country manager for Pacific Women Support Unity in Papua New Guinea, and I will be facilitating our first learning event that we're having virtually. The theme for this month's learning event is focused on small grants, big results. There are a lot of women-led and community-based organizations in our community who do amazing work in providing programs and services in our communities. And most times when we're talking about grants and partnerships, we talk about the impact these programs have on community and on individuals' lives. But today we will talk about the impacts partnerships have in small organizations in being able to comply with donor requirements. We will hear from, at the moment we have two of our organizations online. I'd like to welcome from Fiji, Women's Fund Fiji, who will be represented by Queenie Rabo. Nice to have you, welcome. And then from Queensland University of Technology, I have Dr. Jackie Cowley and Dr. Verena Thomas. So they will be sharing with us the work they're doing in terms of working in partnerships with small grantees and the learnings in terms of compliance and what that requires. So the behind the scene work that goes into working with partners, not the front end stuff you see in terms of programs. So we'll start our conversation and we'll start with the Dr. Jackie and Dr. Verena. Would you two like to start this conversation by talking to us, share with us your experience on how you've worked with small grants, how you worked in relation, how you used capacity building in a partnership approach to develop small grantees systems to respond in compliance to donor requirements. And for everyone who's joined us online, we will have each of our speakers present, and then after that, I will open it for questions. So if you have any questions, put them on the chat box. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miriam and Pacific Women, and thank you very much for the invitation to share our experiences. I won't see who is online and who is listening, but I do hope that some of our partners are online as well, and we'll be sharing with you some of the experiences that we've had together. May I ask Toby if you could share our PowerPoint presentation? And while that is happening, we might make a start, and I hope it will come on soon. So we currently have a number of projects that we work on, but some key projects funded through Pacific Women. One of them is to work on developing communication strategies to address sorcery, accusation-related violence. And under that, a key activity has been the development of a toolkit that is called Communicating the Law Toolkit. And here we work with community-based partners and work with them to develop this toolkit. Some of our key partners are Cook Women for Peace in Chimbu, Cafe Women's Organization in Goroka, the Highlands Women's Human Rights Defenders Network, and Kidu Safe House in Millen Bay. And the Nazareth Center for Rehabilitation is also one of our partners, but they are supported through IWDA. So I think we're slowly getting to the, I'll just keep going. And then when the slides come on, you'll be able to see some of the key points and images as well. Otherwise, I could try and share my screen if that is a way to go. I'll just try that.
Yep, I can see it. Yes, she opened this.
Okay. Thank you. So what we wanted to talk and share today, we've learned a lot in the process of over the past 5 years working with community-based partners. And one of the key things that we consider was important is for us to understand the context that they work in. And so we've done a lot of learning. And so we will share a little bit how we've worked together through a small seed funding program, how we supported partners in documenting the impact that they create, and subsequently receiving funding from donors, and then also direct calls for funding where we worked with them to develop proposals. So one of the key things perhaps to remind ourselves of is that these partners that we've worked on, they are change makers and they've created social movements in their communities, and they started this 20 years ago. So when we came in, you know, they're already very established in the work that they do and very successful with the work that they do. And, you know, Erica Fufurefa tells that story, how they started Cafe Women's Association with women who contributed 20 kina each to the organizations. And as in that process, they were able to build a collective, create a movement that transformed their community. And today they're a key service provider within Eastern Highlands province. And there's a similar story to be told for Cook Women for Peace. So their funding has increased steadily, and they've worked with partners like Oxfam and with us as QUT, and they're now also receiving direct aid funding. So there's been a process. And what we wanted to also remind ourselves of is that when funding is involved, that comes with power dynamics and power dynamics between CBOs and donor partners. And we have to also think about the different levels and layers of accountability. So donors are accountable perhaps to their governments or who they're receiving funding from. And CBOs are accountable to their communities. But then when they receive funding, they're also accountable to the donors and funders that they receive funding from. So in that space, some of you might know our work, but we work very much with creative tools. And what they can do in this space, Jackie will share.
Yes. So, I mean, these are the different kinds of creative activities, and mostly how then do we use these creative activities to understand the context to which we work in. And that's a very key component for us, because we go in not necessarily understanding it. And in terms of the management processes of CBOs, it's important for us to understand that. And we use these creative processes to do that because we recognize that what people do on a daily basis is not necessarily visual. So these creative processes, they capture the knowledge that they have that they don't necessarily know they have, tacit knowledge, and brings that out so that those latent knowledge become visible. We also use scenarios to think through, but importantly in a safe way, the various decision-making processes. And then there's a photograph in the next slide, but that it talks about how these safe spaces are created for us to think through, talk about these management processes. And so they're not necessarily overwhelmed with it, but allowing for that ability to converse as honestly as we can with each other about these compliances capabilities. Thanks, Verena.
Yes, continue. I guess what we're trying to say is how these capacity building principles then are informed and the processes that inform them.
Sure. And it's about this idea of shared learning. So there's a collaboration between CBO, donors, and for us with our partners, it's about how then do we appreciate the learning from each other. But in order to do that, there are processes that are built into it that are reflective. And so we have at points in our managing of the partnership or our collaboration, there are iterative approaches and the reflection. So what went well? What did not go well? How then can we make it better? And we build that into the program as well. And in that process and that overall learning, we unpack the different kinds of worldviews. You know, which is a different one to the way in which a donor's worldview is, and how they can be synergies created through the experiences and bringing that out. And in that sense, developing what we call like an ecological system for sustainability. So what are these processes? What are these synergies? And how then can we build respect, relationships, and reciprocity around it? And these are very Melanesian principles of understanding. And how then do we weave that in so that both of us are accountable, both of us to have whatever donors that we are working towards, but in that process, bringing out the key component of their work. Brina.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the ways to do that is to always look at both sides, perhaps. So even when we use the language of capacity building, we ask ourselves, what is the capacity building that we need to understand the context? When we talk about compliance, we have to also see how can we be compliant with the requirements that are there within communities and respect the relationship. So, sometimes it just helps if we turn the words around and we're looking at each groups in a similar way and look at how we're looking at this idea of capacity building as a way of shared learning. And so perhaps to give an example, this is the Communicating the Law Toolkit. Was developed with the organizations, drawing on their knowledge of working within communities. And so what we needed to do when we started to implement is to demonstrate that this training would have an impact, but at the same time ensuring the ownership of the organizations who participated in the project. So what we did was we provided facilitators with a small budget to pilot the toolkit. And with that, they were giving flexibility how they would use those funds to the best of their ability and knowledge, because it was a pilot. And so they then brought back data from that process and gained experience that then informed further the budget development. And as a result of demonstrating this work, we're able to collectively continue to receive funding from Pacific Women. What was very important in that process was the trust that we put in individuals and organizations to take the lead in the implementation and to pilot that process so that they could make the decisions within their communities what would be best to do. So that is just one example, and that has continued to them now receiving direct funding to do some implementation of the toolkit. But we'll get to that later. But just perhaps a little bit on how we collectively manage those operational processes. Jackie, did you want to share how we then moved from the toolkit to terms of references that they implement?
Yeah, so one of the things in terms of this is the co-development of the budget line. So, having to be part of a workshop with them and to think through like what are the key things that you would need in order to do this one, and designing those budget lines and agreeing to them, but agreeing to the costing of each and every one of them and understanding that these are the budget lines and these are the agreed timelines to which we need to report by. We then collectively also talking through it, developed like a terms of reference for them and for us. And so how then could that be an accountability process as well to, again, support them in terms of delivery of this particular project. And so we agreed to that. But woven into the terms of references were processes of acquittal and communication. And again, that idea of these iterative approaches, so reflecting again on that process, even though we had certain budget lines that go into implementing it, they have these terms of reference, but built also into that is a way that we can continue to support them as well too, by reflecting on what are some of the challenges perhaps, or the good things that they have come up with. And we communicate largely through them, through WhatsApp these days. And that's great because we have these open conversations, about the budgets, and they ask us questions about it. So we have a collective group and we work across the collective group with the partners that we have thinking through that. So it becomes sort of like encourage them again in a different space that they can reach us and they can talk about these different things. But again, one of the impressive things I think coming out from that is that they do read budget lines and they do know to stay within these budget lines and then to work with us in terms of managing this capacity. And perhaps move to the next slide, Verena, or did you want to add for that one? No?
No, and I'm conscious of time, so we're coming to the end very shortly. But just to say that, you know, as our funding, we're aware that our funding for this project is coming to an end. So we've worked together with the partners to apply for direct funding. And it was great that the Spotlight Initiative came out with the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund, and we're able to support the organizations in that application. And it was great that that had a focus on institutional strengthening. So we're currently working with partners to co-develop their policies and to strengthen the organizations. But we have to say that going through that process, we worked with 3 people to support the organizations in filling out the proposal forms. And we had a lot of conversations and then translating that into making it work in the proposal form. So we see there's still a lot of room for improvement to see how we can come together to kind of innovate that space and think about ways these proposals processes can be made accessible. And I mean, there's new things coming out, such as video proposals and things like that. So we're also very happy to explore kind of those spaces, but there's still perhaps a few things to be done. But yeah.
Can I just say just one last thing before the last slide? And that is that, and the difficulty with developing these ones so that they get direct funding from like Spotlight, for example, is that the complexity of the budget in relation to the narrative and how that emerges and how that kind of has to be the same is something, not that they can't comprehend it, but, you know, working across this Excel spreadsheet for community-based partners and having those calculations and then having those things be the same is sort of difficult. And so one of the things about that, one of the strategies that these 3 people that Verena is talking about is talking to them, getting the key components of the things that they want to do, and then talking to them about what are the realities of the budget, and then weaving that in, and then sending it back to them again to see whether this is reflective of what they were thinking about running the project. And that's one, Brana.
Yeah, so in summary, really for us, it's been building trusting relationships, but for us mainly to understand the processes of the CBOs, and how they've successfully created change within their community and how funding can exactly support that without creating too many barriers. And we've done that through collaboratively developing budgets in terms of reference. We've looked at the creative processes and how we can unpack some of our perspectives. And from there, I guess it's about contextualized support and mentoring for the CBOs. But we see that there is a need for an ongoing conversation around these targeted tools, processes, and proposal formats. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. We're happy to receive questions at the end.
Yes. Thank you, Verena and Jackie. I'd like to move on now to Women's Fund Fiji, and we'll hear from Queenie. She will be talking about the work they're doing with small grantees in Fiji.
Thank you, Miriam. Sorry, I'm. If you can hear some background music, those are the construction workers working along the public roads outside. So I'm sorry if you can hear those tractors and all. Just the perfect time to reach our residents, and then you can hear that. But thank you for inviting us to be part of this panel. I'll just get right into it. The Women's Fund Fiji, we began our journey in 2017. So it's a 5-year initiative of the Australian government, Pacific Women Shaping Pacific Development. That is the Pacific Women Program. So in September 2021, we just got registered in Fiji as a local entity under the Fiji's Charitable Trust Act. And Women's Funds Fiji, as you all know, it's the Pacific's first national women's fund. So we provide grants and capacity development support to diverse women, girls, gender non-conforming groups, network and organizations to further their work or enhance their work in gender justice and human rights. So over the next 3 years, the fund will be working on thematic areas, women economic empowerment, eliminating violence against women, strengthening the Women Coalition for Change, women leadership and decision making, and we have climate justice and humanitarian action and influencing aid philanthropy. We have 3 types of grants that we provide to our grantee, to women organization or women-led organization or feminist group. So these grants are sustainability grants. These are short-term and long-term grants that support both the core cost of the group, the core cost of the organization, and also their long-term activities. So they can apply from 50 FJD 50 to 150K per year. And these are eligible for all organizations, rural-based organization, registered and established organizations. We also have the movement building grants. These are grants that are short-term grants that provide support of 100,000 Fijian, that is to support events that contribute towards movement building for gender equality. And these are normally short-term grants, and it's one-off. And then we have the resilient grants. Resilience grants, we support, these grants provide support to our existing, our current grantee partners and those former grantee partners. So maximum funding is around 50,000 Fijian and 50,000 Fijian, and this is mostly just to support them in management of that crisis or those activities for recovery or post recovery. Yeah? So those are the 3 type of grants that we provide, and the reason we provide these grants is to support them in transforming individual attitudes and behaviors to contribute positively to improving the lives of women, girls, and those marginalized groups. So just to add on what have been some learnings from the work that we do with our grantee partners in terms of compliance with our funding requirement. So for us, as a women's fund, we have a feminist principle and feminist values that we are empathetic and we are also flexible and adaptive. So for our grant making process, we have information sessions with interested applicants or interested groups that would like to apply for our grants. And there, during those information sessions, we provide details on the forms itself. So the forms is not, it's not just one form for all the grantee partners. So if they are applying for a grant of 100,000, more than 50,000, then they will fill a form that is well suited for those established groups that can fill those that can complete the form, which are those established NGOs or established feminist groups or women's groups. And then we have another form, the expression of interest form. There's not much difference, but it's just the technical questions that we ask these organizations when applying for our fund. So these forms are used for those unregistered groups that they can apply for our funding. And also the requirement is different. So the requirements for established groups, because they are well established and they know how to manage previous grant, their set of requirement is different from those unregistered rural-based groups. So for those established groups, we will require the same process of asking for their audited accounts, their registration certificate, etc. But for unregistered groups, we require them just to submit a completed EOI form. And in some cases, some of these groups are registered with the Ministry of Women or the line ministry where their key activities fall in. So if they do agriculture work, they might give us a registration from the Ministry of Agriculture. So those are the requirements that we set out, and that has been some learnings from us that we see that the form, we continue to change the form every year when we do a call for funding. It is because the learnings from our grantee partners that we adapt that learning. They have shown us that we need to constantly adapt our development mindset to be more inclusive and responsive to the needs. So when they fill out this form, and you know, this women's group, rural-based women's group, you can be asking them these technical questions. So in that way, we have to listen to them, and we continue to change the form that well suits them. And then we also have our due diligence process. So the due diligence process is just to see the group or the organization's capacity to manage the grant, and also it provides the fund information on where we can provide capacity to support these groups in managing their grant and also implementing their project. So for small grantee partners that we have and work with in very rural, remote areas, and also those groups that even don't have a bank account. So having a bank account is not a requirement for this group, but as we work with them, we build their capacity to the stage that towards the end of their project, they're able to open their bank account. Or some of them, when they're in the proposal stage, they are able to open the bank account. So those are the learnings that we have got from our grantee partners, and we continue to do that because we continue to have that in changing and developing mindset that every time it will change depending on your grantee partners and those that you work with. In terms of capacity building for small grantee partners in a partnership spirit, we continue to do that. The fund team continue to provide an ongoing support towards these grantee partners for their organizational development and for strengthening their organization, strengthening their governance and leadership systems, and also in terms of reporting back to the fund, because reporting back in terms of financial acquittal reports, in terms of reporting back of capturing the impact of the grant. So the fund team continues to provide those technical assistance on the ground through our mail and through our finance team and the program team. And we also have encouraged our grantee partners to have cross-learning events and in the activity. So cross-learning events, they get to visit other grantee partners or other women's group who are not our grantee partners that are doing fairly well, where they can share and go back and build on this. And through this, we have seen that most of our women's group in the rural maritime areas, they don't have access to markets like of their products. And also to get online, that's quite difficult because of the internet challenges. So what they have been doing, they've been connecting with one of our grantee partners, Rise Beyond the Reef. So through that connection, Rise Beyond the Reef is able to buy their products and market it online, and also build the women's capacity in terms of making this product to be of quality and quality control, and also in terms of the pricing of their products. So it's both a win-win situation. So that's what our, in terms of capacity building with small grantee partners for partnership. And we also have grantee partners that just in our networking space, where they share how their journey have started with the fund, like the Naita Sidri Women in Dairy, These are a group of women that the emerging group, and how they have worked on. First, they did not have a bank account, and they have to build on having a bank account and strengthening their organizational in terms of their policies, in terms of their governance system, and then having some long-term sustainable activities. And with sharing that with other grantee partners that are established, like the Fiji Women's Rights Movement, the Rise Beyond the Reef, family, they're able to build each other's in terms of skills, and then able to go back and use this and also apply. So when they do apply for our next call for grant, we see that that what they are asking for, you can actually see that it's progressing towards that long-term sustainability of the group. So it's not only a one-off activity, but it's more like developing of their strategic plan, of their business plan that will further build them as a group to apply for a more funding that would sustain the group itself. So those are the learnings that we have captured on the ground. I think I'll stop there and give it out for questions, and if any, and then I can share more during the questions time.
Thanks, Queenie.
Thank you.
Is IWD on? IWD. Okay. Sorry, I was just checking if our other panel is online. Thank you for your presentations, Verena and Jackie and Queenie. I would like to now open this. Tracy's online? Okay, sorry. Before we go to questions, I do have one more presenter online. Tracy, welcome. Tracy represents the International Women's Development Agency, and she will talk about their experience working with small grantees in Papua New Guinea.
Thank you very much, and my apologies for being late. I've actually been unwell this morning, and I also mixed up the time conversion between Canberra and Port Moresby. Yeah, so I work with the International Women's Development Agency. We have partnerships with a number of organisations in Asia and the Pacific, including several in PNG. Our focus is that we fund partner organisations to do their work, to enable them to both exist, to expand their operations. And we work closely with our partners to develop capacity. And I've heard a lot from Queenie already about the type of work that they support. I think what I thought I might do, and I was really hoping that John from Eastern Highlands Family Voice would be able to participate to talk about things from his perspective. But what I thought I might talk about a little bit is some of the challenges that we face in terms of identifying appropriate funding opportunities for our partners, and some of the ways that we can overcome those challenges. I think we've all seen that the funding envelope, from our perspective, is shrinking. It's many global donors are focusing on other geographic regions, not on the Pacific, and there are a very small number of donor organisations that we can work with. And obviously, we're very thankful to the Australian government for their ongoing support for gender equality in the Pacific, but it certainly faces challenges when you've only got a small number of donors that you can work with. What we are seeing from funding rounds is there's often a very short window between when the fund is announced and when the application closes. You know, we see things with 3-4 weeks. Very rarely do we see the time gap between announcement and closure, you know, much longer than a month or two. And it, as you all know, it takes a significant amount of time to develop proposals. It means that resources, human resources in particular, are drawn away from implementing current programs and core work to divert to developing proposals for funding, and there's real cost implications, both in terms of the cost of people's salaries to develop the proposals, but also that cost of not being able to focus on other work when you're developing proposals. The grants themselves are often short time frames, 12 months, 18 months. It can be really difficult to identify grants that are longer than that. And that has major implications for organisations that are trying to even out their finances and their budgets. It also means that, you know, by the time you've just developed and been successful with one proposal, done all the contracting, set up all the systems, it's time to start thinking about trying to develop the next proposal. And again, that short-term nature. One of the other major challenges is, you know, very few proposals really provide sufficient funding for core business and for administrative support. We see lots of proposals that are funding projects and activities, but that don't fully appreciate or allow for costing of just salaries, operational costs, communications, transport, all of the things that we know that are essential to actually deliver services or other activities. And then, the focus of the grant. Often we see grant opportunities come up if they're for quite specific activities that may not necessarily fully align or cover the extent of, you know, what we think needs to be supported. And there is a danger then that organisations will pivot their work to try and attract the donor funding rather than focus on their core business. So, you know, in a perfect world, donors would actually collaborate more to actually share information about what funding they have available, what they're going for, and actually try to get some better alignment between the different funding sources. But yeah, that's a perfect world. So in terms of how we work, I mean, I heard some of the last presentation around support for organisations applying for funding. I'll just add a few thoughts and then give the rest of the time for questions. But we spend a lot of time working with our partners on due diligence requirements, particularly child protection, PSCAH and fraud. But there are multiple other due diligence requirements that donors might need, including now terrorism and money laundering checks, a whole range of things. At the start of our partnership with any organisation, we spend a lot of time looking at areas such as governance, financial systems, monitoring and evaluation systems. We look at even things like occupational health and safety in terms of buildings. We work a lot with our partners around disability and inclusion, even though these may not necessarily be donor requirements. They're obviously important for ensuring fully inclusive development. We work with partners more broadly just on their gender policies and outreach. And then, ongoing support to partners, particularly around financial monitoring, auditing, and then on narrative reporting. So again, I'm sorry I was late to the discussion, and I hope that's been some useful insights.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you for making it, even though you're not feeling too well. We appreciate that. So thank you, everyone, for sharing your experiences in terms of managing small grantees. We have like 12 minutes, so I could get some questions. I'd like to I probably start with the first question, and that's to build on what Tracy just talked about. When donors develop new policies, and Tracy, you pointed that out, like you, part of the due diligence, you work with small partners to comply in terms of the SEER, child protection policies. So I want to ask, how do you work with your small grantees to orient them to these new policies? And how do you overcome resistance? Resistance comes because there's so much pressure to deliver a program and an activity, but also the pressure of ensuring that they're complying, and compliance has all these other requirements that they have to do. So how do you overcome this resistance of viewing compliance work as additional work, or why do we have to do this? Like, they don't see the value add, but how do you make them see that?
Yeah, I mean, we've been really lucky with our partners in terms of not pushing back, particularly on the child protection and PSCAH. And we talk a lot about just being good development practice and ensuring that the people that we work with, and particularly the most vulnerable people in communities, are safe and that we are doing no harm. I mean, there are some aspects of it which are more difficult, such as complaints reporting, and actually having those processes in place. What we do with partners is we share the IWDA policies that they can use as a template. We've actually got a new partner, not in PNG, but in another Pacific Island country. And there we've actually buddied them up with a larger, more established NGO that already has all of these policies in place. And we're funding that other organisation to work with our new partner to help them develop their policies, because they've got the same in-country context. We have regular chats, and I think that it's around sort of demystifying the process and making people feel comfortable that if they have to report, say, a child protection issue, that it's a dreadful thing, but it's not the end of the world. They're not going to lose funding because of that. They're not going to lose our partnership because of that, but they're more likely to lose funding if they don't report it and don't deal with it. So it's taking away some of the fear and using it as a continual improvement process, and really focusing on that element of do no harm, rather than coming at it as just a compliance issue for the donor. It's doing it because it's the right thing to do and working in the communities, but also being very much guided by our partners who work in the communities about what some of the cultural sensitivities and difficulties will be and how we best address those.
Thank you. Queenie, you want to answer that? And then I'll go to Verena and Jackie.
Thank you, Miriam. Yes, for the fund, when we undergo a due diligence process with our grantee partners, first thing we should do is assure them that yes, it's a compliance check, but we assure them that this is a process that the fund will have to undertake with all grantee partners, and this way we tell these potential grantee partners that this is a way that we can work together in partnership to build the capacity. So you freely giving us all this information will help the fund to know the capacity that you have, and also what is the capacity the fund can provide for you to manage those grants and for you to sustain a group, or for your group to, as an emerging group, to go where you want to go, like where you want to see yourself in the next 3 or 5 years. So that's what the fund always use with the grantee partners when going through the due diligence process. First thing first, because you always have this, when you say compliance check, and it's human nature, people get to have that fear syndrome, like they turn away, or they will not at all be that willing to give those information freely. So what you have to do is you say that, hey, this is a way that we can build your capacity. Yes, you apply for our grant, and we understand you are not registered, you are still an emerging group, and you want to get there. This is how the fund can help you. We're gonna use all this information, and we're gonna use this funding to build the capacity of your organization to get there. And you will network with other grantee partners that are established that will help you get there. So it's more like speaking to them that it's a partnership and we are in this together. So that's what the fund has been using. And we continue to use that when doing due diligence process. And of course, it's human nature, as soon as you say due diligence, but we try as women funders, as feminists, you have to always have that with you. You have to tell them that it's just a way of building capacity and moving you there. So that's what we have been doing with all our grantee partners. And then we assure them that this information are confidential, and we do not share it with any other, and we keep it for the fund team and for the grants committee, and everyone knows that it cannot be shared with any other third party, even with the other grantee partners or anyone outside. That's one process that we use for due diligence. And yeah, and in terms of capacity support, we provide capacity support in these areas of financial management, managing their grant financial in terms of reporting back to us, monitoring, because they need to know monitoring and evaluating the impact of their project, and gender equality and social inclusion, and child protection. Those are the 4 capacity support that is required of all our grantee partners, that they must attend those key ones. And in terms of fraud and in terms of other things that we have to be mindful of in managing grant, we go through that process with them when we are doing a one-to-one, when we do have our orientation session with them. And when we do have our orientation session with them, we group them according to their capacity. So we know if you are a registered established group, you'll have a session with one of the program staff. And if you are rural-based group, you'll have a session with one of the program staff that speaks Itoke language or speak Hindi, that will able to articulate those legal terms, legal jargons better to you, and know what is required when it comes to complying with the grant agreement. And again, we say it's a legal document. It's both your responsibility and us, and then we bring in the accountability and transparency. So those are the process, and those are the things that that we work with our grantee partners. And as I've said earlier, it will change. It does not. It's not a document that we use every year, but and it's the same, but it continues to change every year, because we listen to our grantee partners and we have to make those changes. That's all from me.
Thanks,
Thank
Queenie. Verena and Jackie, anything you want to add to this?
Yeah, Jackie, I'll start and then you end. Yeah, I think similar ideas than Queenie and Tracy have shared. I think it's a process, so we are working together, seeing where the organization is at, workshopping it together to see how it applies, but also seeing that the policies are there to protect the organization, and that they help the organization to make decisions and to engage in these processes. So important thing is that the organizations make the policies work for them. So that's why it's really important to workshop them and for them to see how does that apply in our context. So that it's not a tick box activity that say we have this policy here and if we fulfilled it with a donor, but that we're actually looking into how does the policy apply in practice. So what we're currently trying to develop a little bit with some of our organizations is looking at different scenarios. Because a policy, as we know, when I look at the policy of our university and I read it, then I have to talk to someone to say, well, how does that actually apply? Because I'm not quite, it says it like that, but in that case, would this apply this way? So, I think in any industry, in any case, we're looking at how does it then apply? And the more scenarios we can develop, and experience together, the more experience we get in applying the policy. So I guess that is an ongoing activity. It's a process of learning together, and that's continuing. So I think for us, it's really, in terms of talking to partners, it's about, well, this is an ongoing process of building the organization and strengthening and continuing to provide training and understanding to staff and sharing that.
And I'll just add one component to that, which is the policy component of it. And so because the CBOs that we're working with now are just developing their policies, because they do need it to go for the additional funding or the direct funding. And so one of the feedbacks that we give, I think, is providing a safe space when, you know, there is the idea that they have gone overboard, of them not kind of looked at the ways in which they've spent the funding. And so having a safe space to create and send the feedback back again to the partners is a very key. But one of the crucial things that we've learned in the last, few weeks or so is how then do you, because the policies are new, is the articulation of the policy plus the funding, and how then do these two create that? And so highlighting that in the policy in terms of the funding and keeping to that, because the policy is not just a tick box for compliance for you to get direct funding. The policy is there to support the organizations to grow. So it's having that. And then providing additional feedback to them, again, as both Queenie and Tracy have said, not to scare it, but to create these safe spaces for these conversations. And again, it's how then do you frame the conversation, either in an email or conversing, not necessarily a blaming deficit kind of way, but from a strength-based position to say this will happen for that particular reason. Thank you.
I note we're almost up with time. I see my team has responded to some of the questions online, but I think as a final wrap up, I just want the three of you to give us a quick sort of one strategy that, because you all work with multiple partners, one strategy that you have used in multiple settings because you have seen that it has worked really well in terms of improving compliance or introducing compliance process with partners. Any one of you can answer that.
Well, I don't know if it's a strategy, but it's just reiterating this idea that it's a process. It's not about complying all at once to 10 policies. It's huge, So what is the first policy that's important? What is the key thing? And then building on that. So iteratively strengthening aspect by aspect, because it can be a lot when you're starting out an organization. So it's about prioritizing perhaps what is most important at that point in time and then building on from there.
Mine will be very shorter than Verina's. I think it's thinking about the big picture of the organization and sustainability and weaving that into from the outside to the front part of it. And I think that's what they respond to, is that you want longevity, you want sustainability. These are the components that need to be woven in and to understand that. Thank you.
I think for us, working with our partners so that they understand a lot of what's in the compliance and the policies they're already doing, but it may not just to be written down. And so in seeing that what the policies represent are part of their work, not something that's separate. So it's, weaving it in to the work and as other people have said, understanding why it's important for the organisation as well as the people they work with.
For us, I've already mentioned, is just to always be adaptive and inclusive, and also just listen more to your grantee partners. At the same time, too, you just have to have those. You can be empathetic, but at the same time, too, you have to think of the organization in terms of adhering to your own policies and code of ethics and those things that are in place. But we always believe in being inclusive, listen to your grantee partners, and at the same time develop that mindset that you'll always be inclusive and responsive. and responsive to them for achieving their vision and for them to be sustainable.
Thank you. And I think that summarizes it really well. Listening, I think listening and then sharing and knowing that learning is two-way in the partnerships. And I note also that there's a lot of challenges as well in terms of accessing grants, in terms of short time frames for implementation, applying for proposals as well. Before we finish, I just want to put a plug that the Pacific Women's Support Unit with some of its partners, which Women's Fund Fiji and some partners here in PNG have contributed, and we've put together a practice note titled Small Grants, Big Results. And it should be out in November. So for everyone who's listening and who have joined us this morning, in November, please check out our website to see that. And I want to thank the panelists for sharing all your experiences. We want to try and make this presentation be a little bit more inclusive. So we will be sharing the recording to smaller partners that were not able to access a virtual platform. So thank you very much for your time and sharing all your valid experience with all of us this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.